Hello, my name is Harry Patrinos. I'm with the World Bank. It's my pleasure to be with you today to discuss this very important topic, reimagining education. Let me start by reminding us how important schooling is for society, for families, for individuals. For example, in terms of labor market outcomes, every year of schooling raises earnings by about 10%. This is a very high rate of return compared to other uses of one's resources. And COVID-19 and the school closures have disrupted this education, this path to well-being, and have led to learning losses. We've seen significant learning losses across countries throughout the world, and we've seen that disadvantaged students have lost more. They've lost more years of schooling, they've lost more learning, and this presents for us important equity consequences. COVID-19 and the school closures have contributed to the learning crisis that we had prior to the pandemic. We've seen countries raise enrollments and completion rates in education, and we've seen convergence in enrollment rates throughout the world. Yet despite that growth in schooling, we haven't seen significant changes in learning outcomes. In fact, learning outcomes have been flat throughout the world in all regions. Going forward, we need to address the learning loss and the learning crisis by implementing learning recovery programs, by protecting the education budget so that more spending can go where it's needed to improve learning. And we need to prepare for future shocks by making education systems more resilient in case there are more crises and school closures in the years to come. However, before doing any of these things, we need to measure learning outcomes. We need to use assessments. We need to provide this information to decision makers, to teachers, to students and their families so that we can address specific learning needs. One of the most successful learning recovery programs that we've identified during the pandemic is tutoring. We know that tutoring has been very effective for a long time. We know that tutoring targeted to disadvantaged students can lead to improvements in learning outcomes. But tutoring, face-to-face or in person, is very expensive. But during the pandemic, there were several experiments with online tutoring, which proved to be just as effective as in-person tutoring, but at only a fraction of the cost. Therefore, they're quite cost-effective. And we saw effective online tutoring programs in Europe, Spain and Italy, in the United States, and in several low-income countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. The question of addressing the learning crisis begins with the need for information. We need information on how students are performing, what the gaps are, so that we can address these needs with the appropriate programs and policies. Learning assessments that measure student achievement can help tremendously. They provide information on how students are mastering the curriculum, on their basic and fundamental learning progress, and can guide teachers in addressing their specific learning needs. There's been a revolution in learning outcomes data in recent decades, and during the pandemic, we learned new ways of measuring learning outcomes, including by SMS and telephone, for example. At the same time, international assessments can help. These are useful for comparing education systems, for benchmarking education programs, and help build capacity in countries so they can set up their own national assessment systems. We have many international assessments today and many countries participate, but it wasn't always this way. Before 1965, there were no international assessments. But early in the 1960s, several countries started to participate in these international assessments. And the first one was in 1965. And we've had several since then, including TIMSS and PISA, and several other regional assessments. But 7 countries participated in 1965 and have continued to participate in international assessments. So we've learned a lot about the evolution of these education systems. These countries are Australia, Finland, France, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United States. They're all high-income countries today, but they weren't all high-income countries back in the 1960s. They are high-performing countries. They weren't all high-performing countries in the 1960s. So what do we learn from these countries? First of all, we learn that long-term convergence in schooling outcomes is difficult to sustain. That is, you can get more children into school, you can have universal schooling levels, but sustaining and improving learning outcomes is difficult. We've also learned that schooling, especially the quality of schooling as measured by student achievement, is a necessary component of economic growth. That is, these countries grew economically largely due to the improvements in schooling and the quality of schooling. And we've learned that there's a need for leadership and a focus on learning to continue to improve and maintain high standards. That is, we need information and we need constant reform, evaluation, and refinement to continue to improve learning outcomes. Taking 3 of these countries, we can see that there were disparities in schooling levels as recently as the 1980s, but over time, we've seen convergence in years of schooling. They're all highly educated countries today, and we've seen rapid rises in real income per capita and a convergence in income levels. And schooling, both years of schooling and the quality of schooling, have contributed to that growth in income per capita for these countries. We've also seen that the value of schooling has increased over time. That is, the returns to education. Despite the doubling in schooling levels in these countries from just over 6 years to 12 years over these decades, yet we've seen the returns to education initially decline as the supply of schooling increased, but after that, we've seen an increase in the returns to education. This suggests that the market is rewarding skills, that there's a value to learning, and a continued need for people to invest in themselves and for countries to improve the quality of education. All 7 countries improved learning outcomes significantly over this period of time, going back to 1965 to the present. We've seen improvements, particularly in Finland, which was a rather low performer compared to the rest, and became one of the top performers in the world over the decades. And this was due to reforms in the education system in Finland, moving from a early selection system with a vocational track to a comprehensive education system that valued learning the fundamentals. We've also seen that the gap in learning outcomes has been maintained over time despite improvements in all countries. And we've seen countries improve, subsequently decline in learning outcomes. And we're seeing a sort of stagnation in learning outcomes in recent years. But one country has managed to improve consistently and to maintain the high learning outcomes since the 1960s, and that's Japan. In fact, Japan improved by the equivalent of more than 2 years worth of learning in this period. With a comprehensive education system since the end of the Second World War and several important reforms in the 1990s and the 2000s have allowed Japan to continue to improve its education system. The reform of 2008 that shifted focus from memorization to knowledge and capacity and creativity paid off for the country. The 2017 reform also improved the education system by relaxing the curriculum somewhat, and more recent reforms that are focused on, while continuing the traditional elements and the focus on fundamentals, also promoting the creativity in the education system. And through these constant reforms, measurement, and effective implementation of the programs, Japan has managed to remain one of the few countries that has consistently maintained its high standards and improved over time. And not just among these 7 countries, but among all countries, Japan is one of the top performers. So in summary, we need to implement learning recovery programs because of the school closures due to COVID-19. We need to protect the education budget so spending can be targeted where learning needs have declined. And we need to prepare for future shocks. This will be made much easier if we measure learning outcomes and evaluate programs so that only those that are effective are scaled up and sustained. And since long-term convergence in outcomes is difficult to sustain, then we need to focus on learning and to implement the reforms that are needed to improve learning outcomes. And school quality remains a necessary component of economic growth going forward. What kinds of skills should we invest in? I would call them relevant skills, problem-solving skills, learning skills, communication skills, personal management, and social skills, including teamwork. All of these have been proposed for many decades, but recently we now have evidence that these actually improve learning outcomes causally, and they lead to better employment outcomes and higher earnings. Take, for example, social skills. Working in teams, highly valued in today's labor market, and something we should be investing in the education system. So what I would suggest is that we build education 4.0. If we consider 1.0 the traditional schoolhouse with teachers and students, very much the Industrial Revolution model of schooling, and we move to more collaboration with technology, as we move to a connected, personalized, open access education system, we can start to move towards a lifelong learning system, given the fact that we will be asked in the future to work in many different jobs and fields, and with longevity, people will need to learn and relearn. We therefore need a lifelong learning system, but one driven by autonomy and purpose. Autonomy so that we can focus on people's individualized learning needs, and purpose so that people are getting the skills that they want and need, and the labor market and society is getting the level of quality required to continue to improve social and economic development in the country. Thank you for your attention.